Arthur Schopenhauer perceived something that modernity has not yet managed to digest. The more intelligent you are, the more you suffer. And the more you suffer, the more you need to pretend you do not see. In The World as Will and Representation, he mapped a psychological territory that today we recognize in every infinite scroll, in every muting of a group on WhatsApp, in every time we prefer to seem simpler than we really are. The question is not whether this is cowardice or wisdom. The question is why it became necessary. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to do so now. Warning: this documentary uses images generated by AI for illustrative purposes. Although the visual is synthetic, the content is the fruit of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. In October of 1818, a work of 700 pages arrived at German bookstores and practically no one bought it. The author was 30 years old, had spent his paternal inheritance financing his own publication, and watched the book wither on the shelves. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote to a friend that his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, was being systematically ignored by a humanity that prefers to entertain itself than to think. He did not know, but he had just diagnosed a problem that would only worsen in the following 2 centuries. Schopenhauer was born in Danzig, current Gdansk in Poland, the son of a prosperous bourgeois family. His father, Heinrich, was a merchant and wanted Arthur to follow the business. His mother, Johanna, dreamed of being a writer and ended up becoming one of the most popular novelists of her time. But Arthur chose philosophy. And philosophy, for him, was not a profession. It was a surgical investigation of reality. In his early 20s, he was already attending Fichte's classes in Berlin. He heard Hegel dissertate on the absolute spirit and felt a deep irritation. For Schopenhauer, those grandiose systems were castles in the air. He wanted to understand why human beings suffered so much, why they desired things they did not need, and why, even when they got what they wanted, they remained dissatisfied. The answer came through a concept that would forever change our understanding of human psychology: the will. Note this detail. Schopenhauer was not speaking of will in the common sense, of willpower or wanting something specific. He was describing a cosmic force, blind and irrational, that moves everything that exists, an energy that wants merely for the sake of wanting, that is never satisfied, that transforms all conscious life into an endless search. In the preserved notes of his personal notebooks, we find this revealing sentence: "Life is suffering. Suffering is born of wanting. Therefore, to live is to want to suffer." Sounds pessimistic, perhaps, but Schopenhauer was trying to map something that we all feel, but few manage to name. Think about this. Why does a person who has a house, food, work, and relationships still feel a constant restlessness? Why does someone who has achieved important goals still look for something more? For Schopenhauer, this restlessness is not pathology. It is the human condition. The will forces us to desire things to continue existing. And once we get what we want, it immediately forces us to desire something else. In letters sent to his friend Julius Frauenstedt during his mature years, Schopenhauer described this mechanism in almost medical terms. Man is an animal that cannot stop wanting, and to want is to suffer. The only pause in suffering is boredom, which is another form of suffering. Look how this echoes in the modern experience. How many times have you caught yourself navigating the internet without knowing well what you were looking for? Scrolling feed after feed, clicking on videos that do not really interest you, buying things you do not need, starting series that you abandon in the 3rd episode? Schopenhauer would say that this is not distraction, it is the will operating in its purest state. But there is a detail he perceived, and that is central to understanding our theme. Schopenhauer noted that suffering is not democratic. Different people suffer in different degrees, and the variation does not depend on social or material condition, it depends on the intensity of consciousness. In Parerga and Paralipomena, a collection of essays published decades after his main work, he wrote, "The common man suffers little because he perceives little. The intelligent man suffers more because he sees more. And the genius suffers disproportionately because he comprehends too much." Try to follow this sequence. Schopenhauer is saying that intelligence is not an evolutionary advantage. It is a burden. The more you manage to process information, connect patterns, and anticipate consequences, the more you perceive the repetitive, absurd, and insatiable nature of human desires, including your own. The result is a species of painful lucidity. You begin to see that the greater part of what people do makes no sense, that the majority of conversations lead nowhere, that the majority of goals are merely ways to avoid the void, and that pointing this out resolves nothing. It only makes you a boring person in social gatherings. Pay attention to this specific excerpt from Schopenhauer's diaries written during his period in Dresden. The intelligent man learns early that his discoveries about human nature are not welcome. People prefer their illusions, and he who takes their illusions away is not seen as wise, he is seen as disturbing. Schopenhauer lived this in his own skin. He tried to give classes at the University of Berlin at the same time as Hegel, the most popular philosopher of the time. Result? Empty room. Hegel filled amphitheaters, speaking about historical progress and absolute reason. Schopenhauer stood alone, explaining why reason is subordinate to blind will and why progress is an illusion. It was not by chance that he developed a species of strategic misanthropy. In correspondence with editors, it becomes clear that Schopenhauer learned to dose his ideas. He knew he could not expose everything at once, that he needed to translate complex insights into palatable language, that he had to pretend optimism when he felt pessimism. In short, that he had to pretend to be a little dumber than he really was. But here is the crucial point he discovered, and which connects directly with our contemporary experience. This strategy of dissimulation was not cowardice. It was psychological survival. Schopenhauer perceived that trying to convince people about the problematic nature of existence is a masochistic form of living. You spend energy, generate conflict, and change nothing. It is more intelligent to learn when to speak and when to be silent. In Aphorisms for the Wisdom of Life, he developed this idea in practical details. Schopenhauer described types of social intelligence that today we recognize easily. There is the exhibitionist intelligent, who needs to prove his superiority in every conversation. There is the militant intelligent, who transforms every debate into ideological war. And there is the discreet intelligent, who observes everything, understands more than the majority, but intervenes only when necessary. Which of these types suffers less? For Schopenhauer, there was no doubt the discreet one, because he understood that true intelligence includes knowing when not to use intelligence. Notice how this sounds familiar. How many times have you avoided correcting someone who was clearly wrong because you knew that the correction would generate more problem than the ignorance? How many times have you pretended not to understand an offensive joke instead of explaining why it was problematic? How many times have you chosen a simple answer instead of a complex answer because you knew that complexity would be interpreted as arrogance? Schopenhauer would call this disguised social asceticism, a form of renunciation that does not announce itself, a way to protect one's own psychic energy without seeming superior or distant. But there is a deeper layer in this strategy. In Schopenhauer's personal manuscripts, we find various reflections on what he called fatigue of lucidity. He had perceived that human consciousness was not designed to sustain insights continuously, that there is a limit to how much a mind can process without entering into collapse. Think of the difference between the 19th and the 21st century. Schopenhauer dealt with the volume of information of a medium-sized German city. He knew a few dozen people personally, read a few newspapers, followed a few intellectual debates. And even so, he felt constant cognitive overload. Now multiply that by 1,000. Everyone today has access to more information in a day than Schopenhauer had in months. Everyone has an opinion on everything, and all these opinions reach you through screens, notifications, algorithms that were programmed to keep your attention sequestered. The result is that the fatigue of lucidity that Schopenhauer experienced as an individual phenomenon became a social epidemic. Millions of people live in a state of forced hyperconsciousness. They know too much about wars they cannot prevent. They see too much about lives they cannot live. They understand too much about problems they cannot solve. And then arises, almost as a survival reflex, the art of pretending to be dumb. It is not about genuine ignorance. It is about a conscious and strategic choice to reduce the volume of input, to protect oneself from excessive informational load by pretending not to see certain things, not to understand certain nuances, not to get involved in certain discussions. Perhaps the most interesting thing is that Schopenhauer anticipated this necessity. In his late writings, he speculated on what would happen if humanity developed technical means to exponentially amplify communication and access to information. His prediction was somber. Man will discover that knowing too much is a curse, and he will have to learn to unlearn voluntarily. Look at your own experience. Do you not have the impression that your mind is always too full? That there are layers and layers of information, worry, analysis, and projection happening simultaneously, and that sometimes the only way to function is to pretend that some of these layers do not exist? Schopenhauer would say that this is not intellectual failure. It is intelligence applied to self-protection. It is the will, that blind and insatiable force, being domesticated through conscious strategies of stimulus reduction. But how exactly does this domestication happen? How does someone train the art of pretending to be simpler than they are? And, principally, what is the difference between this strategy and genuine mediocrity? These are the questions that Schopenhauer faced during his entire mature life, and the answers he found help us understand why so many people today feel they need to hide to survive. The difference between pretending to be dumb and being truly dumb lies in the consciousness of the performance. Schopenhauer knew this and developed a true cartography of intellectual dissimulation. In his personal writings, he separated types of hidden intelligence like an ethnographer studies different tribes. There is defensive pretense, which protects those who think too much. There is strategic pretense, which chooses battles. And there is ascetic pretense, which renounces the intellectual ego for comprehending its uselessness. The question is not which of them is more honest. The question is which works better to maintain sanity. In his notes from the Frankfurt years, a period in which Schopenhauer finally found the recognition he had sought his whole life, he wrote a disturbing observation. I discovered that my happiness increased in inverse proportion to my need to be understood. He was over 60 years old when he noted this. Decades of intellectual frustration had taught him something that modernity still struggles to accept. Sometimes being misunderstood is more comfortable than trying to explain oneself. But how does this work in practice? How does someone cultivate this specific form of intelligence without turning cynical or mentally lazy? Schopenhauer developed what today we could call techniques of voluntary cognitive reduction. It is not about stopping thinking, it is about thinking selectively, about creating conscious filters between perception and reaction. about learning to see without needing to comment, understand without needing to correct, disagree without needing to debate. One of these techniques appears detailed in correspondence with his editor Julius Campi. Schopenhauer described what he called the strategy of the empty yes. When someone said something obviously wrong or superficial, instead of correcting them, he responded with neutral variations. Interesting, could be, had not thought of that. It was not agreement, it was energy economy, a way to end subjects that were not worth the wear of a real discussion. Pay attention to how this strategy connects with the deeper Schopenhauerian philosophy. For him, the greater part of human conversations is nothing more than will disguised as reason. People do not speak to communicate ideas. They speak to affirm ego, mark territory, avoid solitude. Trying to converse rationally with will is like trying to reason with hunger or thirst. You might even manage to postpone it, but you will not solve the underlying problem. That is why Schopenhauer developed an almost Buddhist tolerance for empty conversations. He participated in social dinners, heard people speak about politics, literature and philosophy without demonstrating the level of knowledge he really had about these subjects. He let mistaken observations pass. He pretended interest in topics he considered irrelevant. And according to reports from contemporaries, he seemed much more relaxed on these occasions than when he tried to engage intellectually. There is a revealing episode in the biography written by Wilhelm Gwinner, a close friend of Schopenhauer, in his last years. At a reception in Frankfurt, a local merchant was explaining to Schopenhauer his theory on why the Germans were superior to the French. The theory was clearly based on nationalist prejudices and wrong information. Old Schopenhauer, who spoke French fluently and had spent years studying in Paris, heard everything in silence, nodded politely, and said only, "Really, they are complex questions." Gwinner, who knew Schopenhauer's combative temperament well, was surprised. Later, he asked why he had not dismantled the merchant's arguments. The answer was revealing. Why would I waste my energy correcting someone who has neither the capacity nor the real interest in understanding? It would be like trying to teach calculus to a horse. This anecdote illustrates a central aspect of the art of pretending to be dumb. It requires a constant evaluation of intellectual cost-benefit. Schopenhauer had learned to distinguish between people who disagree out of ignorance and people who disagree out of psychological necessity. The former can still be educated. The latter are merely executing internal programs of self-affirmation. In Parerga and Paralipomena, Schopenhauer systematized this distinction through what he called diagnosis of alien motivation. Before entering any debate, he asked himself, does this person really want to understand something new or just want to confirm what they already believe? If the answer was the second, he automatically adopted the strategic pretense mode. Look how this translates to the contemporary experience. How many times have you started writing a long response to an absurd comment on the internet and stopped in the middle because you realized it would be useless? How many times have you pretended not to have seen a problematic political message in the family group? How many times have you chosen to shrug instead of explaining why someone was mistaken about a subject you master? Schopenhauer would say that you are intuitively applying ascetic wisdom. You are recognizing that not all ignorance deserves correction and that not all truth needs to be spoken. You are learning the difference between being right and having peace, but there is a subtler layer in this strategy. Schopenhauer perceived that pretending to be dumb is not just a relationship technique, it is a form of meditation. When you consciously abstain from reacting to intellectual stimuli, you are training a specific type of self-control. You are creating internal space between impulse and action. In personal notes from his last years, we find this reflection. I discovered that I can observe my own irritation arising when I hear nonsense. I can feel the will to correct it forming, and I can consciously choose not to act upon this will. It is a form of freedom that few experience. Notice the vocabulary he uses. I can observe, I can feel, I can choose. Schopenhauer was describing what today we recognize as mindfulness applied to social life. The capacity to have reactions without being governed by them, to maintain mental clarity without needing to demonstrate it publicly. This practice had deep roots in the Eastern philosophy that Schopenhauer studied intensely. He was one of the first Western philosophers to seriously interest himself in Buddhist and Hindu texts, and he found in them confirmation for intuitions he had already developed alone. That suffering is born of attachment, that attachment is born of excessive identification with one's own thoughts, and that liberation passes through some type of voluntary disidentification. But Schopenhauer adapted these ideas to the urban and bourgeois reality of the 19th century. Instead of withdrawing to a monastery, he created forms of social asceticism compatible with common life. Intellectual pretense was one of them, a way to practice detachment without abandoning society. Try to follow this logic. The traditional ascetic renounces material pleasures to reduce desires. The Schopenhauerian intellectual ascetic renounces ego pleasures to reduce conflicts. Both are trying to diminish sources of unnecessary suffering. The difference is that the second can do this wearing a suit and tie, participating in work meetings, and going to family barbecues. In letters to his mother, Johanna, with whom he maintained a complicated but cordial relationship, Schopenhauer described this adaptation in almost clinical terms. I learned to watch human dramas as one watches theater. I know it is staging, but I do not spoil the play of others by explaining that it is all pretense. I let each one live their illusion in peace. Does it seem cynical? Perhaps it is. But Schopenhauer would argue that true cynicism lies in believing that you can change people by forcing them to see truths they do not want to see. Pretense, in this context, is not dishonesty. It is disguised compassion. There is another practical aspect of this art that Schopenhauer explored, the management of psychic energy. He had perceived that intelligent individuals spend disproportionate amounts of energy on unnecessary mental activities. They analyze conversations after they have ended. They keep ruminating on arguments they could have used. They get irritated with their own passivity in the face of others' ignorance. The strategic pretense breaks this cycle. When you consciously choose not to engage with certain nonsense, you save energy for questions that really matter. It is like learning not to run after every barking dog in the street. You are not being cowardly, you are being efficient. In Aphorisms for the Wisdom of Life, Schopenhauer developed this idea through practical analogies. He compared intellectual energy with financial capital. You can spend it all reacting to small provocations and run out of resources for important opportunities. Or you can invest strategically only where there is potential for real return. But what is the real return? For Schopenhauer, it was not convincing anyone of anything. It was maintaining one's own serenity in a world that seems designed to destroy it. It was preserving internal space for genuine thoughts amidst the constant noise of others' opinions. Pay attention to this excerpt from the late diaries. The truly wise person is not the one who is always right, but the one who knows when it is worth being right, and I discovered that this happens very rarely. This wisdom becomes even more relevant in the current context. The internet created an environment where any person can have an opinion on any subject and publish it instantly to global audiences. The result is an informational noise unprecedented in human history. Trying to respond to everything is a guarantee of mental exhaustion. The Schopenhauerian art of pretending to be dumb offers a way out. It is not about becoming really less intelligent, but about using intelligence more selectively, about recognizing that not every intellectual battle is worth fighting, and that preserving mental energy is a form of self-care. There is a last layer of this strategy that Schopenhauer explored in the final writings, the relationship between pretense and authenticity. He had perceived that sometimes it is necessary to hide who you are in order to continue being who you are. That the preservation of authentic identity may require superficial performances of simplicity. This may sound paradoxical, but it makes sense when you understand that Schopenhauer saw human personality as having various layers. There is the social layer, which needs to function in the world. There is the reflective layer, where real thoughts happen. And there is the essential layer, where resides what he called intelligible character, that which you really are, regardless of external circumstances. The strategic pretense protects the deeper layers by allowing the social layer to function in a less conflictive way. It is like wearing a mask at a party. You are not denying your face, only protecting it temporarily to be able to participate in the event. Schopenhauer took this analogy to the ultimate consequences. For him, modern society is a perpetual party where almost everyone is wearing masks. The difference is that the majority of people forget they are masked. They think the mask is the real face. The individual who pretends to be dumb consciously at least knows he is acting, and this consciousness of the acting is, in itself, a superior form of lucidity.